name is Jeff Weinstock. I live on Miami Beach. My dad's name was Marvin Weinstock, and he was a true gentleman and a gentle man as well. I think the three best pieces of advice he ever gave me were, number one, take really good care of your teeth. Number two, remember that as you grow older, you're going to want to live close by your family. And number three, always, always, always be a gentleman. In 1972, my father and mother went to Paris. It was a very big trip for my dad. He grew up in poverty in 1930s and 40s New York. He wore ill-fitting hand-me-downs and was ashamed to bring friends home from school. As a married man, he worked 14 hours a day in the pharmacy he had managed to buy. And he helped my mother raise two squabbling sons. Dad never allowed himself to dream of Europe. The trip was significant for my mother, too. She had never been comfortable with air travel, and later in life, a powerful fear of flying would keep her permanently grounded. But in 1972, Dad's business was good, and Mom was still flying, and so my parents took off for France. They came home 10 days later with tales of castles, museums, and cobblestone streets, but only one story has remained with me until today. In Paris, my parents went to the Luxembourg Gardens to sit and rest on a bench. An old woman came over, jabbering away at them in French. Mom and Dad didn't understand. They tried their basic phrase book vocabulary and shrugged, but the woman continued to badger them. Finally, they realized she was a park attendant and was demanding a few francs for the right to sit on the bench. Who ever heard of such a thing? I was in awe. In France, one had to pay to sit on a park bench. What really struck me, though, was that my parents had interacted with a real French person. Wow, I thought. Not only to be in a foreign country, but actually to talk to someone who was from there. In my senior year of high school, my parents sent me to Paris on a French club trip. As my father saw me off at Kennedy Airport, he called out, "Be sure to say hello to the old lady in the Luxembourg Gardens." When I got to the gardens, there was, of course, no old lady. But I stopped to admire the small reflecting pool and sit for a while on a green wooden bench. The summer after I graduated from college, I traveled for several months on a Euro pass. I came through Paris several times on that trip. When I phoned home every Sunday, Dad would say to me, "Don't forget about the old lady in the Luxembourg Gardens." I loved our private joke, our small piece of family lore that persisted and persevered like a well-guarded heirloom. At the same time, it made me sad to think that this was the memory Dad kept of Paris, of his one time in Paris, and years later he was still stuck on it. My life, I told myself, would be different. And indeed, I started to travel incessantly, first out of curiosity, later to escape from myself, and ultimately as part of a career in international marketing that has kept me on planes for much of the last 20 years. I developed a special love for Paris and visited again and again. Over time, the old French woman vanished from our family's collective memory, and Dad would simply say to me with a wink in his voice, "Don't forget to sit on a bench in the Luxembourg Gardens." And every time I went to Paris, I would make my way to the gardens, sit for a moment on the green wooden bench, and think of my father. The bench became my tradition, my Paris habit. It was my way of thumbing the family nose at authority, at strange foreign customs, at Byzantine rules. More than the Eiffel Tower, café au lait, or even biting into a small madeleine, sitting on the bench became evocative ritual, sacred pilgrimage, rite. I always felt a small twinge of mischief as I approached. Before taking my seat, I would instinctively search for the sign on the back of the bench that read "Interdit," forbidden. I wondered if the old French woman would suddenly appear and demand payment for the last 30 years of sitting privileges. Sometimes I would call my father from a phone booth near the main entrance to the gardens and say, "Guess what I just did?" We would laugh together. But just as often, my pilgrimage would engender a deep wave of sadness as I thought about the circumscribed experience he'd had, how that episode had overshadowed the memory of what I know had been a monumental journey for him. "Dad," I thought, "is that all you remember from Paris?" Eventually, I came to realize that my father's joke about the Luxembourg gardens was his way of connecting to me, of holding on to his son. When I moved to Israel, he enrolled in a Hebrew course at the local community college. When I went to live in southern Brazil, he bought himself a Portuguese course on CD. As I moved farther away, both emotionally and geographically, my dad forged new, unspoken ties with me in order to remain inside my loopy orbit. How proud he was of me, of my crazy, endless travels. How great his silent self-sacrifice which helped me get there. How real the vicarious pleasure he took in watching my life quietly from the side. The last time I was in Paris, I wasn't able to go to the Luxembourg Gardens. I was on a 6-hour stopover with my boss, and he insisted I go shopping with him. 5 months later, my father died. I haven't gone back to Paris, but I know I will. And without a doubt, I will sit on a green wooden bench in the Luxembourg Gardens. And yes, Dad, I'll keep an eye out for the old lady.